Well, we can start with the traditional Latin Mass. So can you talk about how you discovered it and what you appreciate about it?
Well, it wasn't a special discovery back in the 50s when I
Right.
became a Catholic. In the early 60s, it was the only option. Uh, and as I said before, what I love about it is its holiness, its sanctity, its conduciveness to worship. Uh, Insofar as human art and human language has a power, that's the most powerful thing in the world.
And we have
Now,
these.
the mass is perfectly valid, uh, even in its shallower and less satisfactory forms. So it's not simply an aesthetic issue. The issue is, what does it do to your soul? How is it conducive to worship? What difference does it make? One of my favorite ideas of any philosopher is William James, the founder of pragmatism, said that uh, since life is short and we don't have time to engage every single philosophical issue, let's ask first of all, before we ask any philosophical question, is it important? That is, what difference does it make? How does it change my life? And if the answer to that question is it really doesn't, then it's meaningless. It's neither true nor false for all practical purposes. So that's a good question. What difference does the Latin Mass make? And the difference it makes is that it makes you holier. It makes it easier for you to pray. It makes it easier for you to love. It makes it much easier for you to love and adore God.
Everything leads to worship. That's what I found when I discovered the Latin Mass, something that's existed for millennia, and I discovered it in my 20s. I didn't know it existed. And I remember how different it felt, how set apart it was from my ordinary Monday through Saturday. And
It's not, I think it's not that the Latin makes it special, but the fact that it's holy makes the language special. Remember back in the 50s at Yale, some of the priests that said the Latin Mass said it in a very unholy sort of way. They were finished in 15 minutes with a kind of a meaningless formula. A parrot could have done it. And there have been masses in the Novo Ordo, the new form, the English form, that are very reverent. So it's not that only the Latin Mass is reverent, nor is it that the Latin language is the only thing that makes it reverent. It's the decision of the soul to worship God
what are the
demands reverence, including the language.
yeah, what are the things in the Latin Mass that make it conducive to worship? You talked about it making you holier.
Well, for one thing, there's silence in it. Uh, there's no chat room. People don't chat. People don't come to the Latin Mass for the same reason they go to a bar for ordinary conversation. They come for worship. And there is time for silence. And words that come out of silence are powerful. Words that come out of only other words are like little brooks. They may be nice and pretty and comfortable, but they're not.
Yeah. I would love to hear about the English use as well. You said you would attend the Anglican Ordinariate most of the time. You attend
Yeah,
traditional Latin Mass once a month and the Anglican Ordinariate the rest of the time. So why do you attend there? And
same
I don't
reason.
know much about it either.
Same reason. It's from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which next to the King James Bible is the greatest thing in the history of the English language. And it's very holy and very reverent and very beautiful and very special. And it's in English. For those who don't know a word of Latin, although it's fairly easy to learn the basic words and the basic prayers, but those that still find Latin unintelligible, this is the best of both worlds. Familiar English, and it's beautifully reverent.
It's I imagine it's like a higher pitch of, or not pitch, but higher form of the English language. It's not the
Yes,
ordinary
it's
common.
It's Shakespearean language. It's Elizabethan language.
Yeah, which is interesting because when Latin was the universal language of the liturgy, I forgot what century it was, the 5th or 6th century. I know people will correct me on that. Latin was spoken, but this the language that was in use, the Latin that was in use, was a Latin that wasn't used in ordinary speech. So it's even though it was, well understood by everyone, it was uncommon, or it was set apart, like we've talked about.
Right. If you were living in, let's say, the 6th century, you were probably bilingual. You had an international language, Latin, and then you had your local dialect. So automatically Latin was something special, something more universal. And it remains that today.
I've, as I said off air, I'm a huge fan of yours. I'm just glad to be talking with you and hanging out with you. I could literally do this all day, and I'm not.
Well, you know what I say to people who say I'm a huge fan? I say, do you know how Thomas Merton died?
No,
did you get that joke?
No.
He was electrocuted by a huge electric fan.
Oh, that's good. So, anyways, I've I've listened to a lot of talks you've given, books. I've read a lot of books you've written. So I don't know where I heard this story, whether it was in a talk, lecture, or something else. But you told the story of was it a Muslim student who you invited to Mass? Mm-hmm. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, he was one of my students, very holy, very thoughtful. And he said to me once, I've never been to Mass. I have no intention of becoming a Catholic, but I'm intrigued by all forms of worship, and I want to get into your mind and find what it's about. Can you take me to Mass someday? So we did. Went to the little chapel on campus. And he was very reverent. He sat all the time. He didn't kneel. He didn't stand. He didn't really participate in the worship. That would be wrong. But he was very thoughtful and reverent. And afterwards, when we left, he said to me, I thought I understood how you people worship and what goes on there. And I read some Catholic things. I got to ask you a couple of questions. You believe that Jesus, this man whom we also revere as one of the greatest prophets of all time, and we never mention his name without saying peace be upon him or blessed be his name, that this man is literally divine, that he is the Son of God and equal to God the Father, that he is Allah in the flesh. And I said, yes, we believe that. Literally, I said, yes. And then you Catholics, you also believe that when the priest holds up that little round piece of bread and says the words, "This is my body," that ceases to be bread and that becomes Jesus, and therefore that becomes God, and that's why you're bowing down and worshiping. I believe that. You're right. You got it exactly right. He said, I don't think you do. What do you mean you don't? I don't think you believe that. And I misunderstood him. I said, you mean you can't imagine how we could believe something so astonishing, which is why you sat down and you didn't kneel. You couldn't imagine yourself ever getting down to kneel down to a piece of bread that you thought, God. No, that's not what I mean. I mean, I think I couldn't imagine myself getting up off my feet again if I believed that. I was rather impressed. He understood the difference it made.
Yeah, he almost...
He thought it was ridiculous and blasphemous, but he understood how important it was.
I wonder if they're... like how he expects you would act if you actually believed that is the Son of God.
When God appears in the Bible, the result is always... begins with fear. Even when God says his angel, the first thing the angel has to say is fear not. I've got a lot of Protestant fundamentalist friends.
Oh, who's that?
Sorry. Oh, that's your phone, not mine.
No, it's yours.
Dear.
You're all right. No worries.
Turn this thing off.
It's all right.
There we go. Where were we? Oh, yes, my Protestant fundamentalist friends have this familiar language. I was talking to the Lord the other day, and he said to me, and I said to him, and I say to them, when God appeared to you, what did you do? And the answer is usually, well, I just said, hi, Lord, let's have a chat or something like that. I said, well, maybe that wasn't really the Lord. Why not? Well, in the Bible, when God appears, the reaction is something like, I fell at his feet as one dead. Did you do that? No. Well, maybe that was just your own mind. When God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, the first thing he says is, take off your shoes. The ground you're standing on is holy ground. The fear of the Lord is not the end of wisdom, that's love, but it's the beginning.
Yeah, we probably, modern age, America, we have a tendency to treat Jesus just as our friend, Jesus the friend. He did say, I don't call you slaves, but I call you friends. But we miss out that he is also king. He's the king
and
who
that ruins the friendship, because if he's not the king, then it's no big deal if he's your friend.
Yeah.
But if the king becomes your friend, that's really something.
Right. And if the king is on that cross, that means something too.
Goodness, that means everything. That means it costs everything.
Yeah. So I imagine that Muslim student looked around and probably saw some people who were casual, receiving Jesus casually, and maybe there were people in the congregation who didn't act like they believed that was the divine Son of God. But so in one sense, it's no wonder that most Catholics today, so-called Catholics, don't believe in the real presence. And I think that's the fundamental problem with everything. If the church doesn't believe, how are we supposed to evangelize the world if we don't believe in the most fundamental doctrine, the most distinctive Catholic doctrine? So why do you think that's the case, that 2/3 of Catholics don't believe in the real presence?
Well, I'm not sure of the answer to that question. It's got a lot to do with catechesis and the breakdown of catechesis after Vatican II. I travel a lot and give a lot of talks and meet people in various parishes. And in my experience, the one thing that makes the biggest difference, the one thing that renovates the parish and puts life into it, is when the pastor institutes Eucharistic adoration. That changes everything. That's the center from which everything radiates.
I remember reading your book in Eucharistic Adoration, Handbook of Christian Apologetics. It was actually my introduction to you, and that's where I was at in my prayer life. I wasn't at the point where I could spend a holy hour actually praying, but I spent it reading about apologetics, and I read that book I think twice, just sitting there in adoration. But yeah, adoration was the hinge point with my own faith. It was, it began on a retreat. I actually believed on that retreat that you are God, Almighty God. If that's true, like God in the Blessed Sacrament, then my life needs to revolve around you. Everything else has to be secondary. So I started to spend every day in adoration. So totally believe that.
When you know you're in the presence of God, for instance, on your deathbed, you suddenly become very profound, and you don't bother with trivia. And there aren't even many sins that people could be tempted to commit on their deathbed. And when you know you're talking to God, as Augustine does in the Confession, that makes the talk much profounder. Why the book of Job is so profound. Job is talking to God all the time. Three friends are shallow. Their poetry is beautiful, but they're shallow because they're not talking to God about him. Job is talking to God, and therefore God talks.
Yeah, I was like those friends. Well, I remember Francis de Sales saying, uh, you can't measure like your spiritual life based on other people's spiritual life, but it's more based on like your interior intention and where you're at. Because where I was at in my life was I could not sit there for an hour and talk to Jesus, but I just needed to read what Peter Kreeft had to say about him.
Well, you start slow,
Yeah.
and you read books for beginners. I write books for beginners.
Speaking of books, I mentioned this book earlier, but people didn't hear me say it. This, I think, is the best book on Jesus besides Scripture. Jesus Shock. I would say it's my favorite book you've written, Dr. Kreeft. I'm going to read a little spoiler in here. Well, it's what you propose as the solution to the problem. And what would you say is the problem that you're trying to solve with this book, first of all?
The problem is that we superimpose ourselves on Jesus instead of letting him superimpose himself upon us. So we're not shocked by him. We put him into our categories. We let him fulfill our expectations. We see him as an affirmer, kind of a pop psychologist who pats us on the head and says, you're doing well, try a little harder, be nice. Everyone who actually met him was shocked by him. His enemies, his friends, agnostics who didn't know whether they should be his enemies or his friends. So if we're not shocked by him, we're not reading the real Jesus.
Yeah, just as an aside, that reminds me of a quote I once heard about the Latin Mass was that this person said when they entered the Latin Mass for the first time and saw it, it was like I was at the coronation of a king, but I wasn't invited. It's like this thing that's happening without.
He's both right and wrong, because the Mass
yeah.
is the coronation of the king, but everyone is invited.
Yeah, exactly. It is the coronation of the king, but at the end of Mass, you receive the king. The king comes to you personally, and it has this the highest majestic highs and the most humble, intimate lows, if you could put it that way. Anyways, so this is what you say is the solution, and then I'll get to the question. So, so you're introducing, Jesus shock in some different words. So you say, it's Christ the tiger, not Christ the kitten. Get close to him and you feel blood and splinters. You see a fire blazing. You hear the rattle of dry bones coming to life and the shouts of joy and glory and battle that ring through the Psalms and the great old Protestant hymns. It's not polite. It's much more comfortable to see Jesus as a pop psychologist and the church as Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. How do we get the fire back? We just believe everything God has told us through church and scripture and respond with adoration. And everything else that is necessary will follow, as it did for Mary, for whom there was only one thing needful. So, when I read that, it reminded me of a story earlier in the book where it talked about Mary wiping Jesus's feet with ointment, and how you relate that to a crazy gesture of adoration. So can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, this was probably a different Mary. That was the woman who wiped Jesus' feet. Might have been Martha's sister,
Got
or
it.
it might have been Mary Magdalene, or it might have been a third Mary. But whoever she was, she spent a lot of money on that precious ointment and poured it all out on him. And Judas Iscariot was scandalized. And he said, why wasn't this money given to the poor? Of course, he was a hypocrite. He was a thief. He didn't care about the poor. He did care about money. Judas Iscariot, by the way, was the first Catholic bishop who accepted a government grant. They're getting more than 30 pieces of silver nowadays. And he was scandalized by that. And then he went out and sold his soul to the devil. That refusal to adore, that's being scandalized at this woman's excessive love, irrational love, imprudent love, ending her whole self on Jesus. And Jesus approves her. Those around him are scandalized. They criticize him. And he says, this woman's deed is so great it will be known throughout all time. Well, that's what we have to be, like that woman. We can't be prudent. We can't parcel out parts of our soul and say, okay, Jesus, you've got Sunday, and I've got Monday through Saturday. Okay, Jesus, you've got me while I'm in church, but once I'm home, on my own thought. Jesus, you can have me in my prayer room, but not in my bedroom or not in my board. Can't do that.
I love how you say in the book, it's like we're promoting your book. I hope people go out and buy this. But you say that it's the only rational response when you meet the infinite love of God is everything.
What seems crazy and irrational is the only rational thing to do, because if there's a single God who is the source of all truth and all goodness and all beauty and all joy, then how can you possibly live in reality if you don't acknowledge that fact by giving your whole self and your whole life, not just a little part? I mean, if you meet a homeless bum and treat him like a king, that's silly. But if you meet a king and treat him like a homeless bum, that's also silly. God is the king of the universe. So if sanity means living in reality and responding to reality in a way that conforms to reality, then the most reasonable thing to do is total absolute adoration.
I would say when you hear the term, coming back to the Latin Mass, when you hear the phrase Lex Orandi Lex Credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief. And what you just said there, I think the biggest change I've seen in me after attending the Latin Mass is recognizing Jesus as a king and as a sovereign Lord of my life, who is big enough and powerful enough to do anything and to overcome anything, and that he deserves my complete adoration. He deserves my absolute best. You also mentioned earlier about validity. Like, okay, we look at all the masses and we're talking about validity, and that's fine. They're all kind of on the same, baseline. But then there's a certain sense where the liturgy should be the best we can do, the best we can give. Anyways.
Sometimes the best is very simple and primitive. If you're in the army and they can celebrate Mass only out in an open field on a plain table, there can still be total reverence and total love. Not a question just of aesthetics or complexity. It's a question of attitude. And that phrase, Lex Orandi Lex
Credendi.
Lex Credendi, yeah, the law of worship and the law of belief. That's an answer, at least a partial answer to the question, why do so few Catholics today believe in the real presence? Because they don't practice it. We naturally think that you first believe something and then you practice it, but it works the other way around too. You come to believe something only after you practice. You come to believe in love only after you try on the suit and it fits. You try the experiment in the laboratory of your life and it works. You love people and that gives you meaning. The Eastern Orthodox are very profound about that. They say orthopraxy, right practice, often leads to orthodoxy, right belief. So if you practice the adoration, you have it.
So anyone listening now, submit your questions for Dr. Kreeft. As I know in his talks and everything, his favorite part is question and answer. So if you have any questions, please share them. So I have a few questions just to wrap out the interview. But what is the church mumbling?
That's the church that speaks with a voice that wants to make people feel happy and comfortable and smiley. The end determines the means. And if your end is simply to make people like you and to make people say, you make me happy, well, then you're going not to use trumpets, and you're not going to challenge people, and you're not going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to pat them on the head. Here is some free psychotherapy. Come every Sunday morning. I'll make you feel a little happier. That's nothing wrong with psychotherapy, and certainly nothing wrong with happiness, but that's not what the church is about.
Have you heard of moralistic therapeutic deism?
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
term.
that's what that reminds me of. Is
A new religion, yeah.
yeah, that newest. Well, maybe not newest, but believe so. Is a study done by Christian Smith, maybe Professor Christian Smith or Doctor, at Notre Dame, and interviewed young people, probably like millennial age by today's standards. And he came up with this term to describe most of their beliefs, which is moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic, I just got to do good things and good will come back to me. Just got to follow the rules. Therapeutic, like you said, I go to Sunday morning mass and I just want to feel okay. I just want to feel nice. And deism, God exists, but he's not involved with my life. He's not a king who demands anything of me.
He's a book on the shelf, and you can take him down when you need him, and then you put him back when you don't.
Here's our first question from Jacob. Jacob, thanks for submitting it. Dr. Kreeft, what has been your experience with having lived through the conciliar, post-conciliar period? I've heard that the liturgical sphere leading up to the council was predominantly, if not nearly exclusively, low mass. So without a choir, with just the two candles and mostly in silence. So what's your experience with having lived through the conciliar, post-conciliar period?
My experience is one of a lot of confusion and the takeover by those who wanted to hijack Vatican II of Vatican II, so that what Vatican II called for was really in contradiction to the so-called spirit of Vatican II, which was invented by the media. I think somehow or other, the middle managers, the DRIs, and the experts took over. Ordinary parish priests, in my experience, are good people and sincere people and people who genuinely want to be holy, and so are popes and great bishops. But in between, you've got this middle management that bureaucratic and administrative and doesn't understand or respect holiness.
Liturgical councils.
Yeah, and well, imagine Jesus at a meeting of the USCCB. I don't think he would be comfortable.
Very bureaucratic. You're right. It's a meeting of CEOs. It seems like.
But the church has survived that. One of the arguments for being a Catholic is that at every period in the church's history, there are problems. Jesus chose a donkey to bring him into Jerusalem, and he keeps using the same jackasses to run his church, and that the church should survive such idiots as us. It's a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. There are exceptions. The church produces great saints, and most Catholics are not wicked people, but for the visible organization that has as its job to save souls, to transform sinners into saints, to get people to heaven, by far the most important job on earth. For Jesus to trust it to people like us. Well, look at the apostles. Peter has foot and mouth disease until the Holy Spirit comes, makes every mistake possible. Judas betrays him. All of them except John run away when he gets crucified. And we've done that ever since. Yeah, there are heroes and martyrs and saints. They're few and far between. And the religion of most of us is pretty paltry. And for God to entrust his church to people like us, and that organization has remained perfect and infallible and never compromised a single doctrine and never stopped being countercultural and offensive to society around them, and nevertheless didn't compromise. That's a miracle. There's no other institution like that in the history of the world.
Yeah. Another question came in from Amanda. This goes back to what we're talking about, Lex Orandi Lex Credendi, specifically about... actually, I'll word it this way. Do you think... So you talked about Eucharistic adoration. Do you think the rise in popularity in adoration is a response to the lack of quiet in the liturgy? The noise versus silence. You talked about the chattiness versus the silence. So do you think there's a causal relation there?
Of course there is. Human heart was designed in heaven, and we need adoration, we need silence, we need reverence, we need worship. And if we don't have it, like eating food without salt or eating food without water, we need it. And if we don't have it, we look for it wherever it is. But we're like plants. You'll notice that a sunflower always grows towards the sun, and its roots go towards where there's water. Not conscious, that's unconscious. And that's true in us too. Even if we're offended by the silence and we don't understand it, and even if we're negatively challenged by the solidity and the seriousness and the demandingness of faith, still something else in us is attracted to it. There's a kind of a homing pigeon that wants to fly home. There's a kind of magnetism that wants to get back to its magnet. You can't suppress that.
It is demanding. Like when I'm sitting there in the pew with my 3 kids and my wife, and we used to have to take our kids back 5 times in one mass because they're so loud, and we just go back and forth.
Oh yeah.
And everything else is silent. You're supposed to be quiet, and it's really demanding, and it's not nice. It's not comfortable. But I find after mass, I needed that. I just find that I've reset, I've reoriented. I needed that silence.
It's like I've never been in boxing, but I know some boxers. They say after a really tough workout at the gym, and after sparring and getting your head almost knocked off, you leave the gym and you say, "Thanks, I needed that." It's good.
Yes. So, from Matthew, have you ever had a mystical moment of prayer that profoundly changed your life?
No. I wish I did. God gives us all what we need, and he specializes, and he's given me some good inspirations and some good ideas, but I had a kind of mystical moment. It wasn't in prayer. It was on a surfboard when I realized how tiny I was and how big reality was and how the ocean was a kind of a symbol of God. And if you just lose your ego and let yourself be one with it and follow the wave, nothing else matters.
I love your honesty, Dr. Kreeft. I remember you were in a debate once with a Muslim, or maybe it was a former Muslim, and it was the first time in a debate, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, where I saw someone who's supposed to be there debating, knowing everything, and you basically conceded the point and said, oh, I got to think more about that. I've never thought of it that way. And
it's amazing that that's rare.
I know. It's right.
If you don't stop thinking for a minute, God has no room to send his angel into your mind with better thoughts.
I think that's so needed in our culture, and specifically in, the traditional Catholic movement. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to be experts on the liturgy. I'm making a feature-length documentary on the liturgy, and I don't know everything about the liturgy. That's why I talked to Dr. Kreeft. And it's okay not to know things.
If you did know everything about the liturgy, it would be boring. There would be nothing to learn, no mystery. That's why we're not going to be bored in heaven. God's infinite, we're finite. He's new every day.
Yes, mystery. Talk more about that. So when I think of mystery as it relates to the liturgy, specifically the traditional Latin Mass, I don't know about the English use, but traditional Latin Mass, when I think of mystery, the priest is facing God. He's obscuring what's happening. I can't see everything. I can't hear everything. Like, back to our example of the coronation of a king. It's like, it's not waiting for me to do something to continue. It's happening. It's this objective thing. And that, when I think of mystery as it relates to the liturgy, I think of the silence, the Latin, the priest, facing God. And I think that we need that, because if Sunday's ordinary, if Sunday's just like Monday through Saturday, then we don't get reoriented in our worship. We aren't led to adoration. We're led to moralistic, therapeutic deism. Anything you want to say on mystery?
When you utter the word mystery, most people think of detective stories. Something that you don't know now who did it, but you will in the future. A problem that has a solution. The solution comes through calculation. That's not the deepest meaning of the word mystery. Or some people think mystery is just, you don't know. There's something dark, something that is concealed. That's not wholly wrong, but the essence of mystery is not something negative, it's something positive. When Hamlet says to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamed of in your philosophy. Horatio has just seen Hamlet's ghost. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he doesn't know what to think. And Hamlet reminds him that reality is much bigger than your thoughts. Moreness. Not lessness, not an absence of light, but an excess of light.
I can't wait to go to heaven. Are you with me? I just can't wait.
With you.
I'm by God's grace, I just cannot wait.
Well, I can wait, but I also have a great desire. Yes,
that's a good point. So another question from Jim Well. Do you think the growing number of youth interested in the Latin Mass and the traditional movement has been seen somewhere in the church history? Maybe what he means is, has occurred at other times in church history. Jim, well, if that's not what you meant, you can clarify.
I don't know the answer to that question,
Yeah.
but I imagine that is so. The church goes through cycles, as everything in nature does. And the youthful and new movements usually take over, and the old leaves drop off, and the old rotten branches drop off. That happens again and again and again. So I'm not surprised that it's families and young families that usually come to the Latin liturgy. I was at a conference at Boston College many years ago, sponsored by an organization of theologians that was dedicated to modernism and progressivism. And the gray eminence who called the meeting, all these experts, gave the concluding address. And one of my students was there. I wasn't there myself, but he told me that in the address, he looked out over the audience and said, I don't see a single head in this audience that is not full of gray hair or what is happening. Yeah, it's dying out. We lost a couple of generations, but the church is getting much stronger. The world is getting much more toxic. The church is providing more powerful antidotes.
Here's a question from Cynthia. Thanks for the question. While a person may be silent during the majority of the traditional Latin Mass, please speak to the use of a missal with, the English and Latin side by side to participate and follow all the beautiful prayers stated by the priest, etc., to deepen our experience.
Silence is a form of active participation. There is contemplation, which goes beyond words. There's meditation, which uses words, but it's not necessarily vocal. And then there's vocal prayer, where you open your mouth and use words. All three are appropriate, and all three are appropriate in the Mass. So I'm very much in favor of a Latin English Missal. That's what Vatican II called for, active participation in the liturgy, which doesn't mean the abolition of silence and chatty talk.
Or a bunch of activities. Let's multiply activities. Yeah. Yeah, and you have vocal prayer, meditative prayer, and contemplative prayer, and vocal prayer should lead to those deeper forms of prayer.
I find I'm 83 years old now, and even though I have ADD, that's no excuse. I'm not very good at praying, and I find that I have to go back to vocal prayer more often than I want to. Meditation is hard, contemplation is harder. It's for everybody. But the temptation to leave vocal prayer and leave the words and go into something superior, the temptation to think you've done that just because you've left vocal prayer and are now in some sort of state that's probably 90% your own thoughts and 10% God's thoughts. That's an illusion. That's kind of dangerous. I think we have to be humble and patient with ourselves. God is incredibly patient with us. We're less patient with ourselves than God is. My favorite prayer says, God, give me patience right now.
Patience means long suffering, though, so maybe I want that later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something I love about the Latin Mass is you have vocal prayer, but it leads to, like I mentioned the story earlier, it's a Mass that I can pray at, and I'm not my prayer is not interrupted. And actually, the holiest part of the Mass, the canon of the Mass, the consecration, that's in complete silence. If you listen closely, you might hear the priest whispering. You'll definitely hear the bells when they ring. But Benedict XVI says that anyone who attends the Mass with a silent praying of the canon will know what a really filled silence is. Full. It's a silence that is full because it's full of silent prayer, and I love that idea. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Who is this question from? From Jimwell. Thanks, Jimwell. Why does modernism seem like an elephant in the room at our current times? Thank you, Peter Kreeft. I'm an avid reader and a fan of your books.
Well, modernism is essentially the denial of the supernatural, a reduction of religion to the natural. And on the natural level, our religion is very rich, very precious. So there's a temptation to take its natural dimensions and make that the whole. For instance, it's morality, it's ethics. It's largely a natural law ethic, and that can be shared by all human beings. So to emphasize things like social justice, that's fine as long as it's not exclusive. But what makes our religion so special is not the same as what makes it so common and so general. And the modernist emphasizes that common stuff because he wants approval. He wants to get along with everybody else. He doesn't want people to look down at us as weird. So that's a permanent temptation, I think, in every age of the church, especially today when, for the last few centuries, Christianity has been declining throughout the religion, largely because of the improvement of nature and the natural, through science and technology. So it's easy for us to so emphasize the natural dimension of our faith, especially the animal, that we ignore the supernatural. So it's a permanent temptation. It's clearly a heresy. It usually doesn't clearly confess its heresy and say, I do not believe in a transcendent God. I do not believe in creation. I do not believe in miracles. I do not believe that Jesus really rose from the dead. It usually disguises itself and says, oh, yes, I believe that Jesus rose, but Jesus is just a symbol for faith. And that's what rose from the dead. And I believe that there's some sort of a God who has something to do with nature, but that God created everything out of nothing, that's ridiculous. It's not usually honest enough to say that.
Do you have time for one more question?
I certainly do.
Okay. So Marvin asks, and I think my wife is on, maybe she'll join us. So we're not here to attack the church. The church doesn't.
I hope not.
We don't want to attack the church from within. We don't want to, spark argumentation within the church. The goal of Mass of the Ages is to open wide the doors for people to experience the traditional liturgy, the awe and majesty of the traditional liturgy, see how beautiful the liturgy can be, and that can influence their faith. So, but this question is important, Marvin. I think this is an important question. So, Dr. Kreeft, why do you think our bishops are averse to allowing more traditional practices in their diocese?
Because they're administrators and they want peace and they want stability and order and progress. And you threaten all those things when you challenge people to do something different and something higher. Bishops are not necessarily holier or wiser than anybody else. There have been some notoriously bad bishops lately, and some wonderfully good ones. And as I said before, the fact that Jesus entrusts his church to such people as us is amazing. If you're asking for the motive of the average bishop to avoid rocking the boat, I suppose it's a mixed motive. On the one hand, there's something that's indefensible, a fear that people dislike you. On the other hand, there's something that's almost defensible, namely responsibility. You're the captain of the ship. You've got and souls are at stake. You don't want to sizzle.
You're a captain of the ship. What did you say after that? I think you kind of cut out.
There are a lot of souls on this ship, and you're responsible for all of them. And you don't want fights among the sailors because there's going to be casualties. So I think we, who often criticize our bishops, have to be a little more patient and sympathetic. Like ourselves, their motives are mixed, and they're usually at least partly honorable.
Yeah,
you can criticize them and be sympathetic at the same time.
Right.
In fact, unless you're sympathetic, they're not going to hear your criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if you don't want them to be the best captains of the ship that they can be, then do you really love them? So kind of you need both. Pray for your bishops. If I was a bishop, I would be a terrible bishop. So I'd be an okay bishop.
Somebody once asked me a really silly question. They said, "There's no rule that a pope has to be a bishop or even a clergyman. What would you do if the church made you pope? What would be the first thing you would do?" And I said, "Resign."
Well, yeah, you wouldn't accept it, right? You just say, "No, I don't accept."
The wisest thing any American president said was Harry Truman's remark. He said, "In this great land of ours, every little baby that gets born is capable of winding up in the Oval Office. That's just a chance the poor little bastard has to take."
Oh man. Well, Dr. Kreeft, I am so glad you spent time with me this morning as we figured out the bane of technology. And thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us, with your audience. I'm so grateful you did that. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
I know your time is valuable.
All the work. I just sat here and answered questions.